What an amazing passage, an amazing encounter with God that God has with Moses here. A lot of great stuff to get into, both here in chapter 3 and part of chapter 4. I remember it was in the early 90s when I watched and saw my first superhero movie. It was a 1989 movie of Batman that was directed by Tim Burton, and Jack Nicholson played the Joker. And I remember watching it and just being so drawn into it. I've never seen anything like this before, as I was just about to become a teenager, and just loved the whole saga and the story. And since then, of course, I've seen a lot of other superhero movies. And there's one thing I've noticed about superhero movies, and that is rarely are they known by or called by the people being rescued. But you think about all the superhero movies that have come out, even the last 5 years, and they're all known by the person doing the rescuing, the superhero. So there's Batman and Batman Returns and Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises, all the Avenger movies and named after Captain America and Spider-Man 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, Superman. None of these that I know of are known by the name of the people being rescued, like Metropolis or New York City or people who are in need. No, it's always the story of Spider-Man, the story of Batman, the story of Spider-Man. And that we don't really even think about that because we just know the stories about them. The point of the story is the one who's doing the rescuing. That's obvious when it comes to those stories, movies. But why does it become less obvious when it turns to the real story, the story of our lives? And why do we make it so much about us, the ones in need of rescue, rather than about God, the one who does the rescuing? As we go through this amazing story in Exodus, it's obvious that God is the one who rescues. Israel, they're the ones who need to be rescued. And we're going to see, especially in this week's story, but it's going to come time and time again to the surface, that the point of the story is God. The point of the story isn't Israel. The point of the story isn't Egypt. The point of the story isn't even the drama that may pull us in, that we love to see displayed out in the movies. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is God. And when it comes to the story of our life, this is what we need to hear and remember. You are not the point of the story. God is. You are not the point of the story. God is. Now, what does that mean? And what does that mean for how we think and live our lives? Let me break that down into 3 questions, and these 3 questions will help us as we go through our passage. The first question is, what is God doing? Second question is, who is God? And then the third question, who is God using? All right, so that's where we're going to go as we dive into this passage. Let's start with that first question. What is God doing? What is God doing? And for this, we're going to see God's plan as it's unfolded and revealed here to Moses. If you were here with us last week, you saw that at the end of Exodus chapter 2, it's kind of this amazing climax is building as Moses comes out of Egypt, as he's sent away from Egypt, and he's kind of on his way to the promised land as he meets the Midianites, where he gets a wife and eventually has a kid as well. And things are kind of being set up for Moses now. And we read these amazing verses at the end of chapter 2 where the people of Israel are crying out to God for rescue. They're crying out for help, and their cry for rescue from slavery comes up to God, and it says that God hears them, and God sees them, and God remembers his covenant with Abraham. That means he's going to act on it now. And God knew all that they were going through. So the stage is set for something awesome to happen. So what is about to happen as Moses and God as God is about to move in meeting Moses? Well, in the beginning of chapter 3, we are given, the curtain is beginning to pull back as we see the big picture of what God is about to do. And here's the big picture. The big picture is God is about to rescue his people for a purpose, though. He's going to rescue his people to reveal himself to them. They are to be rescued for God to reveal who he is. Bill read the story, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it here in the beginning of chapter 1. So Moses, he's out of Egypt. So let's pretend that this cage here is Egypt, where all of the people are still in slavery. And Moses comes out of there, and then here he has this amazing encounter with God. And where does it take place? Moses is at this mountain, right? Here's the mountain. And what does Moses see on this mountain? Something that should not happen. He sees this small little bush, all right? And what is happening with that bush? But it is on fire. It's burning, but it's not being consumed. This is where it's nice to have color here, because I don't need to just do anything nice, just scribble some colors up there. But what was supposed to happen normally, the bush being consumed, wasn't happening. And he has this amazing encounter with God, and God tells him then that he needs to take off his sandals. Why? Because he is on holy ground. And God lets him know that he's about to do something for his people, to bring them out of slavery in Egypt, to bring them to himself. God speaks to Moses this word of hope, that he is on the move. So that what Moses is now experiencing in this encounter with God, as God reveals himself to Moses, God is giving Moses a little teaser, a little trailer, because what Moses experiences, God wants to do for all of Israel. In fact, if you skip forward to Exodus chapter 19, this is exactly what we read happening. It's not just Moses at the mountain anymore, but all of Israel is now at the mountain. And what happens with all of Israel? Again, there is fire on the mountain, not just in the bush, but everywhere at the top of a mountain. In fact, what is happening on that mountain is it is declared holy, so that all of Israel needs to be careful of how they even come close to the mountain. Just as God revealed himself out of the bush, speaking out of the bush to Moses, so for all of Israel, God will speak, and he will let them know, this is who I am, and this is what it means to be my holy people. But how do we get there? How does God get his people out of slavery to this mountain, which will then be on the way to the promised land? And in fact, there's a more important question than that. And that is, how does God get his people to know him? Because at root, that's the biggest problem here. His people don't know him. And God rescuing his people out of slavery was just the means that needed to happen, the thing that needed to happen for God to bring them to himself so that they would know him and commune with him and serve him with joy. In fact, I think as you look at verses in Exodus 29, these verses stick out to me as probably the theme of the entire story of Exodus. And this is what God tells his people: I will dwell among the people of Israel and will be their God, and they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am Yahweh, their God. What is the big picture? What is God doing? He is rescuing his people to reveal himself to them. Now, as you look through chapter 3, there are more details that we can read about. So in chapter 3, verse 8, God lets Moses know, I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, the promised land. So God is going to deliver his people. You go down to verse 10, and God tells Moses, come, I will send you to Pharaoh. That Pharaoh, that is the person in that position who was just out to get Moses and kill him decades later or earlier, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So God is going to deliver his people. How is he going to do that? By sending Moses. But not only that, he gets a step more specific at the end of chapter 3, verse 19. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he, that is Pharaoh, will let you go. So what is God saying he's going to do here? But God is going to strike Egypt. And this is what we know as the plagues. God is going to show the might of his hand in taking his people out. Now, why does God give these details? Why does God give to Moses a heads up? Look, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you, but also I'm going to do something amazing to show just how strong I am, and how against me, feeble and weak, the superpower Egypt is. Well, one reason why God lets Moses know this is so that when it happens, it will be obvious to everyone that the only reason this happened is because of God. God tells Moses exactly what's going to happen. So when that exact thing happens, everyone know exact that it is the exact word of God that happened. So that all the glory would go to God. So all the reason, all the explanations for Israel coming out of slavery has nothing to do with luck or anything to do with anything natural, but has everything to do with God. God is revealing himself to Israel through his rescue plan. God rescues us so that we would know him. God has rescued you, if you are a Christian, so that you would know him. God didn't rescue you just so that you can sit passively on the sideline. No, God rescued you so that you could actively know him and pursue him. Are you actively seeking to know the living God? Can you, like the Apostle Paul in Philippians, say, look, everything else to me in life is like trash compared to the surpassing, amazing glory of knowing Jesus Christ? Is your heart steadfast in pursuing to know the living God? Because that is why God rescued you, to commune and know him. What is the sacred ground that you have set up in your life to know God? We know everything in a way is sacred because God created everything. The bush was just a normal bush. The mountain, in a way, was just a normal mountain. But when it became a place where Israel communed and met with God and God revealed himself to them, it became sacred, holy ground. Moses had to take his sandals off. What is that sacred, holy ground for you? Where you commune with God. Where you hear God through his word and read him reveal himself to you. Lately, for me, it's been at the top of our stairs. My 4 and 5-year-old, usually my time of reading the Bible and prayer is usually between around 5:30 and 6:30. And that's about the time that our 4 and 5-year-old also often want to get up and start the day before anyone is ready to start their day. And so to kind of get them as soon as they try to get up and sneak around, for the last couple months, I've been doing my devotions sitting on the stairs so that as soon as that door begins to creep open, I can be right there to lovingly pounce on them and usher them back to where they need to be. Now, it is a little awkward, it is a little cramped to have my Bible there, my iPhone flashlight there peering down on my Bible, my coffee there, of course, my prayer cards with me. But over the last couple months, the top of the stairs for me has become a sacred place. It doesn't feel comfortable. I'm looking forward to when I can get back to my nice chair in our living room. But because that has been the place that I have met God in prayer and his word, it's been amazing. Now, I don't want to paint a picture where every morning it's just glorious and angels come down and speak comfort to my soul or anything like that. There are many mornings where my heart and mind are just struggling to get engaged. But the stairs have become for me a sacred place. What is the sacred place where you meet with God? Knowing that you are rescued by him so he could reveal himself to you and you could commune with him in his word. Because you're not the point of the story. God is. And every day, if your heart is anywhere close to as sinful as mine is, you need to be reminded of that again. And that's what God does to us in his word. So what is God doing? God's plan, he rescues to reveal. And even in the very Exodus, we begin to see amazing truths about God. So that leads us to the second point here. Who is God? We're going to start to look more at God's character here. And this is really part of what God does throughout Exodus. He reveals who he is, who his character is. And we get these amazing verses as God reveals himself, especially in verses 13 and 14 here. Look at these verses. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, well, what is his name? Of course, names were a big deal back then, right? So what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. Wow. Drop the mic. This is amazing. I am who I am. And he said to them, say to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now, we could just spend so much time on this because this is amazing what God says here. You want a name? I am. I define myself. I am who I am, or what we will say, he is whom he will be. We can't narrow God or define God by ourselves. God is self-defining. There is no other like this. There is no other like him. No other name like him. This is what makes God God. This is the godness of God. He is who he is. And nobody else can say that. This, as a lot of translators try to make sense of the Hebrew, is what the name Yahweh is, but it is really just so hard to translate because it is God saying who he is. The best translation is simply, I am, or he will be who he is. And this is incredibly confronting to us, God saying, I am who I am. It confronts us on a couple levels. For one, God's name confronts our imagination. God's name confronts our imagination. Why is that? Because we get so imaginative sometimes about God. We want to make him into our own image. As it's been said, God made us in his image, and often we want to return the favor. But God is who he is. He will be who he will be. And wherever our imagination or the modern mind's imagination wants to portray God, he will always be this immovable mountain and wall that we will have to deal with, and we get to deal with. God's name confronts our imagination. And it also confronts our thirst for autonomy. Our thirst for autonomy. This is a theme that we've brought up often. It's certainly a theme that was a part of what Pastor Zach preached on a few weeks ago. The modern self, we today just want so much to be autonomous, to be ourselves, to define our own destiny, to define our own identity. The path to my health and happiness and flourishing is found in being the most me, the most authentic me that I can be, my most authentic self, whatever that proves to be. Or as all the Disney princesses, how they sing it and put it, just follow your heart wherever that may lead you. In a way, this modern way of putting it is just saying, I will be whom I will be. I am whom I am. In other words, the modern sense of self wants to take something that is only true of God, because only God can say, I am whom I am. Only God is he, can it be said that he is self-defining. Only God is self-defining. Everything else in the world, everybody else in the world can only really be known in relationship to the Creator, because we are all created. We cannot say, I am who I am. We can only say, I am whom God has created me to be. He is, God alone is whom he says he is. We are not whom we think or say that we are. We are only whom God says that we are. Do you see how we've just twisted this around? We want to be able to say from our heart of hearts, I am whom I am. But that's only true of God. So God's name here confronts our thirst for autonomy. We can't just follow our heart because our heart is wicked and deceptive. So we're reminded that we're not the point of the story. Because in the story, the true story, there's only one I am. God is the great I am. And yet also in this story, he is incredibly personally involved. He is involved with what is happening with his people here. God is personally involved, and some of this we already saw in our passage. At the end of chapter 2, we saw that, we read that God saw his people, he hears his people, he knows what his people are going through. And here in chapter 3, what do we read? But those same exact words being used. So in chapter 3, verse 7, God says, I see the affliction of my people. I know their sufferings. In verse 9, and now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me. That is, I hear what they're going through. So God sees, God hears, God knows. He's personally involved. And not only that, but God keeps his covenant promises. Remember the promises that God made to Abraham. The blessing would come through Abraham's family as they become a mighty nation that he will put in the promised land. God is personally coming to now make sure that that promise happens. That's why the last part that Bill read is true. Verse 15, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you to make this promise happen. But how can this happen? So in one sense, we see God as the great I am, but in another way, we see that God is personally involved. How could both of those things be true of God? How can God be this amazing, powerful being, and yet also personally involved? We see these true truths about God most clearly come together in the most clear revelation of the character of God, and that is the Son of God, Jesus Christ. When you read the Gospels, you read about a Savior who sees sheep wandering without a shepherd, and his heart being patient and gracious and full of compassion for them. But we also read about a Jesus who in John 5 is confronting the religious leaders and says to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. What is Jesus saying there? Jesus is saying there, I am whom I am. You can't put me in a box. I defy all boxes because I am pure God and true human, true man. I am. That's how we see these amazing truths about God coming together in the person and work of Jesus Christ. You're not the point of the story. Jesus is. How are you seeking to know this Jesus? I got an email a couple weeks ago from our brother Glenn Watt that we know is going through an incredible time with cancer and a lot of stuff these last few years, and he's in a difficult place right now physically. But he emailed the pastors just to let us know of something that dawned on him as he was having his time with the Lord. Let me just read what he said in his email. He said, it dawned on me that I've been reading through the Bible every year for decades, and it's how I still start my day, albeit laying in bed now. I'm probably telling you something that you hear from many in the congregation, but I realized it has become as much a part of me as breathing. I kind of remember that it seemed hard in the beginning, and now I couldn't imagine not reading my psalm, my proverb, the New Testament and Old Testament, along with some study. So pass this on from an old, broken Christ follower, that it does get easier and will become a part of who you are. What is Glenn saying there? He is saying, you know what? It was really hard for me for a while to get in the Bible, to have that sacred time of hearing from God and his word and communing with him in prayer. But over time and over years and over decades, even now as he's in this incredible valley in some ways, he just opens it up. And even in his bed now, it is sacred space for him to commune with the living God. Because he knows he is rescued to encounter the revelation of God and commune with God in his word. Why do we spend that time to know God? Because we're not the point of the story. God is. Well, if that's true, you may be thinking, okay, so what about me then? If it's all about God, if the point of the story is God, then do I fit into the story at all? That's the third question. Who is God using? And here we see in chapter 4 this amazing summons by God of Moses, and I think of us, to himself and to serve him. And in chapter 4, we see God as he's already said, Moses, you're the guy to stand before Egypt and to stand before Pharaoh and to tell him, let my people go. Moses, this is starting to churn in his mind and heart now, and he's really wondering, okay, is this true? What's going to happen? And Moses presents to God 3 problems, and for every time Moses presents a problem, God's got the solution. The first problem Moses has, when he stands before at least God's people and says, okay, here's the plan, is he thinks that he has a credibility problem. He thinks he has a credibility problem. How are they going to believe me when I stand before them and say, God sent me, we're going to get out of here soon? So what does God do? Okay, Moses, I'm going to give you 3 signs. The first sign has to do with a staff in your hand. Drop it, it's going to become a snake, and then pick it up again by the tail, which sounds crazy. You don't do that, but it's going to become your staff again. In case that's not enough, I'm going to give you a second sign. What's this God's second sign he gives Moses? Well, put your hand in your cloak. It's become leprous. It's going to look like it's fallen apart. I mean, that sounds creepy. You put it back in there, and it'll be better again. And in case those 2 signs aren't enough, Moses, here's what you're going to do. I'm going to turn the Nile, which was the source of life for Egypt, the Nile River, it's going to turn into blood. God gives Moses these signs to affirm to Moses and to God's people and to Pharaoh eventually the credibility that Moses really was a messenger sent from God with a message. He gives him these unexplainable signs. Are you wondering if you have a credible witness to the people around you? When you talk to people around you and don't know if they'll believe you, believe the message, believe the gospel, what kind of credibility do we have today as Christians? When so much of what we believe is just out of step with what our culture believes today. People may be wondering, and you may be wondering, what kind of credibility do we really have in the eyes of the world today? What sign can we point to? Well, the sign that God has given us in the main message of the gospel, the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you feel like you have 0 credibility in the eyes of the world, just point to the sign that God has given us, the cross and resurrection. The cross, which is foolishness to the world, and the resurrection, which you can't work your way around. The tomb had a body, and then the tomb didn't have a body. That's the sign of God's power and work today. That's the sign of the credibility of this gospel message, which we so eagerly embrace. If you're not part of a Sunday school class, I encourage you to consider joining the apologetics class, which is, I know we're a few weeks into it, but you can still join and kind of hear a little bit more about the credibility that we have as Christians in the message of the Bible and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Moses thought he had a credibility problem, but God gives him a sign. Second, Moses thought he had an ability problem. An ability problem. He says to God, as we look at verses 10 through 12, I'm not eloquent, God. I've never really spoken well. I'm slow of speech and of tongue. So what does God tell Moses? What's God's solution? God's character. He reminds Moses of who he is. That says character somehow. Who made you, Moses? Who made your mouth? Who makes people deaf? Who makes anybody able to speak to begin with? I did, Moses. So you think you don't have the ability? I created you. So trust me. Sometimes we think we don't have the ability to do something God is asking us to do. But sometimes I think that saying that, and maybe this is true for Moses, sometimes our thinking, God, I can't do this. I'm not really gifted in that way. Sometimes that can be a subtle form of pride. Why? Because we're more preoccupied with our thoughts than God's thoughts. Sometimes our thinking, I don't think I can serve in that way, is really us just saying, God, what I think about me is more important than what you're calling me to do. It's not the boastful form of pride, but it's still a preoccupation with self. It's a false humility, really. God may be calling you to serve in some way, and maybe you think you're questioning whether you really can, and that's just another form of pride in your heart, keeping you from doing what God is calling you to do and serving Him. What you think about yourself is not more important than what God is calling you to do. God's character, His word, the fact that He created you and has recreated you in Christ is enough to do whatever He's calling you to do. Well, Moses has one more thing he can throw out to God. We see that in verses 13 through 17. It's not his credibility, ability, but now his availability. God, he basically says in a polite way, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. Again, that's somehow availability. So what does God say to him? Okay, I got your brother Aaron. He's coming. You're going to tell him what to say, and then he's going to be the mouthpiece of Pharaoh to you. Just as I'm the mouthpiece to you, Moses, so you're going to be the mouthpiece to Aaron, who will be the mouthpiece to Pharaoh. What is God giving him? He's giving him community. God's community. God's community. We never serve in a vacuum in a way, but we're surrounded with other people of God who are serving and rubbing shoulders with us. Now remember, all of what's happening here is happening while this conversation with this burning bush. Moses still, his sandals are still off. He's still standing on holy ground. He is having this encounter with the high king of heaven. So God isn't here just saying, Moses, you know what, I would appreciate if you would volunteer here to do these things that we really need help with. I really need someone to do this. And it's not even that he's told what to do. No, God is summoning, the king is summoning Moses. Moses, do this because I am the king and I am the rescuer, and you do what I say because that will always be what's best for you. Moses is before the high king. He's not gently asking for volunteers. The high king is summoning him and us to serve in community. So why don't we do this? Because we forget that we're not the point of the story. God is. Why is this whole exchange between Moses and God in the Bible? Again, to let Israel know and to let us know that when Israel comes out of Egypt and they do meet with God in the mountain and they eventually make their way to the promised land years later, they'll know it had nothing to do with Israel. And it had nothing to do with having a charismatic, gifted leader. It had everything to do with God. Because the story of Israel wasn't about Moses, it was about God. Have you ever heard of Philip Tan? Philip Tan? Maybe not. And to be honest, I never heard of him until this week. He was an extra in that first superhero movie I watched, Batman. Not only was he any extra but he was goon number 6. He didn't make it to goon number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, but he made it to be an extra goon number 6. In the story, which is, of course, about the rescuer, Philip Tan found himself a place, an extra. But because he was an extra in the story that wasn't about him, I could still go online this week and see his name listed in the IMB, whatever website it is, Philip Tan in Batman, goon number 6. And this is our role. This is our role in the story of God and his rescue plan for his people. Not to be goon number 6, but when he summons us to serve, we raise our hands saying, yes, Lord, we will serve. Whatever credibility, availability, and ability we have, we see God for who he is, we hear his word, and we serve. Maybe your serving's like what Lauren mentioned at the beginning of the service. We're always in need of more people to help out with kids in our kids area, Lord. That would be a great way to serve the Lord. Maybe it's another way this week. Either way, the point of the story isn't you, it's God. I'm going to give you a minute now to pray, to evaluate your own heart, to know what is God calling you to do this week in light of this truth.